Welcome back, everybody, to this edition of Pandemic Radio brought to you by COVID 19. Today, we're going to be talking about infectious disease epidemiology part 2, focusing specifically on disease eradication. So, we're probably all getting pretty sick and tired of this whole COVID 19 business and wondering, is it possible to get rid of these diseases? It seems like they're just coming at us. We just learned about infectious disease emergence. Is it possible to cure the world of an infectious disease? Good question, and I'm glad you asked. We're going to talk about this week how it's possible using the magical powers of epidemiology to basically get rid of an infectious disease in human populations. It's been done before, and hopefully we'll do it again. So, infectious disease eradication, put literally, is the quote, purposeful reduction of specific disease prevalence to the point of a continued absence of transmission within a specific area. Okay. So, put another way, it is eliminating the disease from a population and tracking that population over a specific period of time to ensure that no new cases are occurring. And this has been done. This has been done with the disease smallpox. So normally if I was in class right now, and maybe I'll just do this anyway, feel free to raise your hand if you're listening to this, and maybe everyone in the room will, think you're quite strange. But how many of you have been vaccinated for smallpox? Looking around, I'm seeing not a lot of hands. But maybe that's just because it's me and my houseplants here. Well, the reason you're not vaccinated for smallpox is it does not exist in nature anymore. Smallpox was the first infectious disease to be eradicated in humans. And this is a really big deal because smallpox was a devastating infectious disease caused by the variola virus. It was spread from person to person through coughing and sneezing, much the same way that the coronavirus is spreading right now. It was highly contagious and usually infected people through the inhalation of infectious respiratory droplets. So, coughing, sneezing, and things like that. Unlike COVID 19, smallpox had a particularly high case fatality rate of 30%, meaning that for every 10 people who contracted smallpox, 3 would not recover. And the disease had a human reservoir, meaning this was not a zoonotic disease that spilled over from animal populations. This started in humans and spread from person to person since its beginning. And its beginning goes back a long time. This is an ancient virus that, since at least the time of the Egyptian mummies, thousands of years ago, this virus has been circulating around, spreading from person to person ever since. We know that because there have been traces of smallpox found on Egyptian mummies. So, this is the mummified head of the Egyptian pharaoh Ramses V, 3,000 years old. And you can see these little kind of pustules on his face. Those are kind of trademark indicators of smallpox infection. And when scientists actually went in and kind of looked in there, they were able to find traces of this virus. So this thing has been around with humans for a long time, highly contagious, and pretty deadly. And what's interesting about looking at mummies for this kind of clue is that when you have a disease like smallpox that, we'll talk about this in a second, causes these trademark blisters on your skin, normally it's hard to go back in time and try to uh, reverse engineer or put a long timeline on diseases, because if a disease like the flu, for example, kills you, and 100, 200 years go by, there's no evidence of essentially what killed you. All that's left is usually a skeleton. And unless the disease causes some kind of trauma to the bone, there's not going to be any evidence of what actually kind of killed the person. So this is not true with mummies because as part of what makes a mummy is the fact that their skin tends to be preserved, and so you can see these characteristic lesions on their skin. And this is the kind of natural history of smallpox. Natural history meaning what it does from when you're exposed to it, when you're first exposed to the virus, to when symptoms start to emerge. And so typically incubation periods would be around 12 days, so a couple weeks on average between when you are infected with the virus until when early symptoms start to emerge. And those early symptoms typically included high fever, which is pretty vague and nonspecific. A lot of infectious diseases begin with a high fever, but then it moves on after a few days into the characteristic indicators of smallpox infection, which are these kind of pustules and scabs that occur on the skin. And as this is occurring, patients get more and more infectious because these little skin pustules actually contain high concentrations of the virus. And here's what that looks like. These are what smallpox lesions look like. This is a person that's been infected with the smallpox virus. And this person is in the stage of illness where these pustules have started to form. So, probably this person was exposed to this disease maybe 2.5 or 3 weeks ago from the date of when this picture was taken. And so you see a lot of images like this. If you're looking into smallpox and kind of what it did, it was a devastating disease. Not only did it kill you, but it caused a lot of kind of pain and suffering in those who were infected. And again, this is the characteristic symptom of smallpox infection, where these pustules and infectious blisters on the skin. So up until the 1940s, 1950s, smallpox was found worldwide. This was a disease that was endemic in many parts of the world, including the United States, South America, Africa, Europe, and Southeast Asia. Um, and it was, like I said, a disease that's been around with us for quite a long time. So the thinking is that since at least going back to the Egyptian mummy days, that this virus has been circulating around the world from person to person in an unbroken chain of transmission ever since. So think about, when we're talking about the COVID-19 pandemic and we're talking about flattening the curve and we're all really focused on transmission, person to person transmission. Imagine a virus that has been circulating around the planet, infecting people nonstop for thousands of years, possibly 10,000 years. There's evidence going way back that smallpox has been around for a long time. So, this is like the opposite of these emerging diseases like COVID 19. These are the old grandpa viruses that have been with us for as far back as we can measure, basically. So the global community said, enough, enough of this. Uh, we think we have the tools, we think we have the scientific know how, and we have this really cool thing called epidemiology that I think we can get rid of this. So the World Health Organization and the United Nations began an aggressive smallpox eradication campaign um, to basically wipe out this disease from human populations. And so you can see globally where this disease geographically was last reported. So in North America, for example, the disease was last reported in the 1950s, and Africa was the last to get rid of this disease. And we'll talk about that in a second. But essentially, the disease was eradicated in nature in Somalia in 1977. That's the last known natural occurring case of this disease. So the World Health Organization began the smallpox eradication program in 1967, at a time when the disease was endemic across 31 countries. And you all know what endemic means, right? Good. The disease resulted in 10 to 15 million cases per year, across these endemic countries. So, think about how many cases we're talking about with COVID-19 right now, and then think about 10 to 15 million cases per year going back for as long as we can measure. It's pretty staggering. So to think that this disease was actually eliminated, it's pretty hard to wrap your head around, and it's pretty incredible. It shows you the power of epidemiology. So the global eradication campaign was highly effective. So you see in the 70s up until kind of the end of the decade there, global reported cases really plummet and then eventually drop to zero. With Africa being the last region in the world to eliminate the disease. And in 1977, the last naturally occurring case occurred in Somalia, and it was declared officially eradicated by the World Health Organization in 1980. So the World Health Organization actually put this kind of stamp of eradication approval on this disease. And this is not something you see very often because this is the only time this has ever been done, that we were able to completely eliminate a disease from the planet. We were able to do this because a highly effective vaccine was developed for smallpox. And it basically involves this kind of bifurcated little needle where you kind of poke the skin and you know inject a tiny bit of the vaccine under your skin. This usually forms a little reaction that looks like this. I actually went to grad school with someone who was researching smallpox for his dissertation. He was looking at studying smallpox as a bioterrorism weapon. And because he was working in lab facilities that potentially could put him at risk for this, he had to be vaccinated. So every day in class, he would show us kind of the progress of his smallpox immunization. And it has this kind of characteristic of not kind of healing. Usually, when you get a shot or you get a cut or something like that, it heals over time. This basically stays fresh. So his bandage, he kept showing us under his bandage for like I remember a few months, and it kind of stayed fresh looking, like it had just happened. So epidemiologists employed what's called ring vaccination to ensure that this disease could be wiped out. Essentially, what that meant was finding and locating every case of this disease and doing what's called ring vaccination around each case. So essentially, what they would do is they would track down a person that had smallpox infection, and they would basically go around and vaccinate every person that comes in contact with them or has come in contact with them or maybe would come in contact with them. So forming basically a kind of ring of immunity around that infected person, thereby blocking potential exposure to other people that might potentially come in contact with that infected case. So the vaccination efforts, the ring vaccination efforts, worked, and the disease, like I said, was eradicated in nature. Dot dot dot. But it does still technically exist in two known locations. The first is in a CDC government laboratory in the United States, and the second is in a government facility in Russia. These are where we know that the disease is kept. They're kept basically just in case we might need it to form new vaccines, or just in case we might want to study it more. A lot of people in the bioterrorism communities and in the kind of pandemic communities are skeptical that these are the only two places that this disease exists. and that a lot of groups and other countries have been actively pursuing kind of smallpox programs as part of bioweapons programs. The disease may also still be found in smallpox graveyards, graveyards that contain graves where people have died of smallpox, and if they become like frozen in permafrost, for example, in parts of Russia or other kind of cold areas, um, as the world goes through climate change and the permafrost layers begin to melt, is it possible that some old frozen virus could kind of resurface? So we keep the virus around in these really high containment government labs, biosafety level, um, 4 or higher labs, meaning this is what it looks like to go to work there. And if you're working on a disease like this, it is the most strict um, biosafety protocols possible. So this was either a picture taken there or a picture taken during my last trip to the grocery store. Can't really tell anymore. So, how are we able to do this? A disease that was all over the place, infecting millions of people to zero, and in a pretty short amount of time, actually. Well, like I said, there was a very effective vaccine that was developed. It was not a new vaccine at the time that the eradication campaign was mounted. So a large proportion of the global population was already receiving smallpox vaccinations. So we didn't necessarily have to start from scratch. The virus was relatively simple and genetically stable, meaning it wasn't like the flu virus that mutates all the time, so we have to get new flu shots every year. It basically stayed stable. It kind of stayed, um, you know, like itself. So a vaccination could, provide immunity and then keep immunity against it. So we wouldn't have to keep going back and like revaccinating people because the virus kept changing. It didn't have a zoonotic or environmental reservoir, so it didn't come from like water or bats or dirt. It came from other people. So it was possible to trace contacts and to do like traditional epidemiological investigations and find infected people, trace them to like their contacts, do ring vaccinations. A lot easier to kind of track and stop a disease when you know it comes from people and you can track person to person spread. The disease was fairly contagious, but not the most contagious disease out there. So it had an R naught, estimated R naught of about 5, meaning for every one person with smallpox, they would infect on average about 5 others. Um, and rarely were there subclinical cases. So people that were infected with smallpox who showed no symptoms but could still walk around infecting other people. So basically, if you had smallpox, people knew that you had smallpox. So it was easy to find cases and then do ring vaccination and things like that. So, good news. Uh, we know that it is possible and feasible to eradicate a virus or a disease from the world. And the World Health community, the global public health community, is currently focused on trying to eradicate other diseases. So, a couple of the current targets are polio, measles, and guinea worm. This is a guinea worm. Guinea worm is what we're going to talk about now. It is a really horrible parasitic disease that is on the verge of becoming eradicated and has been actively pursued as a eradication target um, for a while now. And we're going to talk a little bit about the eradication efforts and kind of where we stand now with things and why this is so much more difficult to get rid of and get a hold on compared to smallpox. So, guinea worm is, like I said, a parasitic disease that has a rather kind of complex life cycle. And what's interesting about its life cycle is basically how it gets humans to help it complete its life cycle. So we'll talk about what that means in a second. So the life cycle of guinea worm basically starts with contaminated water. Water that has been basically infected with the larvae of a female guinea worm. The larvae get digested by these little copepods, these little kind of water fleas, eat up the larva. And as they grow, this is an important part of the life cycle of the worm. You need these little guys to help this life cycle go to the next stage, which is being ingested by a susceptible human. So when someone goes up to a water source and these little copepods or water fleas that contain the guinea worm larva are in this water supply and the person drinks it, this little guy goes into the stomach. The larvae, the water flea becomes digested and kind of dissolves in the stomach acid, but the larva resist this initial digestion and essentially migrate to the intestinal walls and into the body cavity, where they begin to grow and mate. So once a female guinea worm is fertilized, she slowly begins to move and grow to outer extremities within an infected person, and this process could take uh, a year or longer, where you don't know that you're even infected with anything. You've consumed some contaminated water, and this worm is slowly growing inside of you. And these things can grow up to 3 feet. So imagine a 3 foot worm slowly growing inside of you, winding its way down your leg, looking for a little escape. When it's ready to release, when the female is ready to release her eggs, she needs to make contact with the water again. So if you're a person with a guinea worm in you, basically what it does is poke out of usually your foot or some other outer extremity, but it could be other places in your body. Um, and it produces an incredibly painful burning sensation at the site where it's poking through. I've heard people that have experienced this refer to it as like being poked with a hot fire poker, like a poker that's been left in the fire and then put against your foot. And so if that is the feeling, the natural response to that is to go run and, dip your foot in some water. You feel like your foot's on fire, the only relief you can get is basically dipping it in water. But this is exactly what the worm wants, because as soon as you dip your foot in water and that worm makes contact with the water, it releases its fertilized eggs back into the water supply. If there are these little water fleas in that water supply, they can then go and help continue the cycle. So as the worm slowly begins to exit this wound, and you can see this is someone's, it looks like, ankle. This is the little hole that the guinea worm has poked itself out of. This is the site where basically it feels like your foot is on fire. The only way to remove it is slowly, inch by inch, little by little, pull it out. And basically, this can take months. You don't want to just cut it off or for risk of maybe killing it, because it could be several feet wrapped up, wound around tendons and ligaments and stuff inside of the leg, and you don't want it dying in there and causing infection. So you need to keep it alive, pulling it out bit by bit, usually wrapping it around a twig or a little piece of gauze here. So this person will go in to a treatment facility, get a little bit pulled out, maybe an inch at a time, and then they'll come back the next day. A little bit more get pulled out, and then a little bit more. And all this time, while this is happening, this person could still infect water supplies if they came into contact with it. So now is the time where you take a break from this lecture and watch this really interesting TED Talk uh, where this woman, Kelly Callahan, does a really good job of explaining guinea worm eradication efforts and giving you kind of an overview. So go watch that, get a snack, grab a coffee, wash your hands, um, and we'll come right back. Welcome back, everybody. I hope you enjoyed that TED Talk and are feeling a little bit hopeful about where we are right now. Um, as this graph indicates, and this was statistics maintained by the Carter Center, Jimmy Carter is a US president or former president. And he started the Carter Center, which is basically his kind of global health nonprofit. And they've really been leading the way on trying to eradicate guinea worm. This is kind of their like project. And they've gotten it down to from in 1989 almost a million cases to in 2015 22 cases. So imagine if we were still in class. I mean, the number of people in the world with guinea worm could fit in there. Basically, it's like our epidemiology class. Pretty staggering, considering that this disease doesn't have a lot going for it like smallpox did. It does have an environmental reservoir. It is found in water. It can be asymptomatic for a year or more while it's growing inside of people. Um, and it has a lot more kind of complications. It doesn't have a vaccine. Um, but what we were able to develop was a pretty simple public health intervention that involved these filter straws. So if this water from this photo was contaminated with the water fleas, uh, if people were to drink the water through these little filter straws, those would get kind of filtered out and blocked and not ingested. So you could still drink the water without infecting yourself with the guinea worm. So, really amazing progress has been made from millions of cases in 1986 to just 22 in 2015. So you would think, well, it's 2020. Why haven't we seen that little World Health Organization stamp of eradication? What's going on? Um, Turns out we're frustratingly close, and we thought we might be able to eradicate it, but that target keeps getting pushed back. If we're so close, if we got it down to just 22 cases, why can't we get rid of it? And you guys all saw this coming, right? Why can't we get rid of it? And here's the why though family. Terrifying. I know. So this leads us to our assignment. Um, why is guinea worm still here? Why can't we finally just snuff it out? Why can't we just take those 22 little cases and get that down to zero? What's going on? A little bit of a hint in this photo. So enjoy the reading. I would encourage you to do a little Google Scholar search on guinea worm eradication. And I think you'll find it interesting the factors that are causing guinea worm to resist eradication efforts and why there's still hope for eradicating this disease, in our lifetimes. So we'll see. But this has been Pandemic Radio, the epidemiology COVID-19 version, and a little bit of hope for us out there that, well, when nature throws us a new infectious disease, well, it's possible for us to fight back and get rid of one. Unfortunately, we're kind of at this rate of, more emerging infectious disease are kind of coming at us, but all hope is not lost. It is possible to get rid of them, and epidemiology is a big reason why. Um, so take care, everyone. Wash your hands. Practice physical isolation, but don't socially isolate yourself. Go on some Google Hangouts, Skype with your parents, um, and do what you need to do to take care of your minds. All right. See you next time.